Very good evening to all of you. Thank you all for joining me. I appreciate it. We left off in 1 Samuel 29 Bible study with David being turned and his 600 men. David and his 600 men being turned away from the Philistines. They didn't trust him to partake in the battle against many of his comrades and King Saul. So they turn him away and tell him to go back to Ziklag. It takes 3 days for David and his 600 men to get back to Ziklag. This would have covered about 75 miles total. They would have covered about 25 miles per day. That's a lot. So they're going to be exhausted by the time they get back to Ziklag, their home. This is where their wives and their children would have been. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captive that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. Very unusual how they didn't, well, it actually wasn't unusual for them to just take hostages, captives. They could have sold these women and even the children for slaves. They could have also have used them for kind of a hostages to keep David and his men from attacking them, because they knew David, he would retaliate. But David had already been attacking them. In my honest opinion, I think that this was a bit of retaliation that God was allowing on the part of the Amalekites, kind of to get David to see this is how it feels. Because David had been raiding them, but the Amalekites are more merciful to these Israelites than David was to the Amalekites, because David would go in and slaughter everyone in the city so that they couldn't tell the king of Gath what he was actually doing. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. This is part of the ugliness of war. They didn't know what had happened to their family. They come back, leaving the city unguarded. And this is just such a horrendous situation. I mean, imagine coming home from work or something, and your wife and your children are gone, and all of your stuff, you've been robbed, and they've been taken captive. Kidnapped is what we would say. So I mean, just imagine that. There's a scene in The Patriot that I think reaches this kind of emotional level.
John? John, this is not a time for vengeance. This is a time for mourning. John.
And David's two wives were taken captives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Even David's own men thought about stoning him. I mean, of course, they're not thinking rationally, but they have to blame someone. You feel like you have to blame someone for such a tragedy. But notice how David understands, and he's also greatly distressed. It falls into this depression mode that you feel. But David, for the first time, we're told that he calls back out into the Lord. And David encouraged himself in the Lord. Sometimes all that you have to talk to is yourself and God. The whole world doesn't want to hear your voice, so you just talk to yourself. Charles Spurgeon's got a good quote on this. Some of the best talks in the world, he said, are those which a man has with himself. He who speaks to everybody except himself is a great fool. You ever just get alone and talk to yourself? Those are valuable conversations. And notice how you'll tell yourself things that you would never utter to anyone else except God. Adrian Rogers used to say that God is the perfect person to talk to because he won't tell anyone. God has nothing to gain by telling people stuff that you tell him during prayer. Other people may think, "Oh, I'll be more popular. They'll know. I'll feel like, you know how gossipers, they feel like they've done a service to the community by gossiping. God, God does, he owns everything, so he's a very trustworthy person to talk to. And David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. Once again, David is going to the Urim and Thummim. It's assumed. And by the way, there, even in the comments, I read this. If you think that you should do this today, that you might as well start sacrificing bulls again because they did not have a Bible back then. We have God's Word today. They didn't have a full Bible back then. We have God's Word. Back then, this was a very necessary step to take. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. A little extra info about this time period we're told about in 1 Chronicles 12:19, and there fell some of Manasseh, the other an Israeli tribe, to David when he came with the Philistines against Saul to battle, but they helped him not, for the lords of the Philistines upon advisement sent him away, saying, He will fall to his master Saul to the jeopardy of our heads. Now, whenever it's saying they fell and that David will fall to him, it means that they'll help. It's an old English term, but it just means that, and they're helped some of Manasseh to David, and he went to Ziklag. There fell to him of Manasseh Adnah and Jozabad and Jediel and Michael and Jozabad and Elihu and Zilthai, captains of the thousands that were of Manasseh. So these would have been very experienced captains within the tribe of Manasseh. So David's army is expanding and more experience is coming to it. They're getting to be better fighters. They're more knowledgeable about warfare at this time. Very, very encouraging, very accommodating. It couldn't have come at a better time, these experienced captains to David's army, because they're needing them. They just traveled 75 miles in 3 days. Hundreds of them, they're very tired, they're very exhausted, and now they're very depressed. So they're needing this encouraging veterans. So David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those that were left behind stayed. You'll see it right down here, Ziklag, and they're exhausted. You have to remember, these men are exhausted. It's in the heat of the day that they're walking, and they're walking over 100 miles now in 3 or 4 days. They're just exhausted. So 200 of them stay behind at the brook. But David pursued, he and 400 men, and 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. They're so exhausted, David loses 1/3 of his men. But this also would have aided the soldiers as well, because they could have looked over the supplies. They could have just said, okay, we'll just leave whatever that you don't want to carry anymore, leave it behind, and us 200 will guard it until you all get back. Could have also maybe served as some kind of reinforcement. So David and the 400 remaining continue en route, hunting for their wives and children. And they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he did eat, and they made him drink water. So they just see, and they're trying to track these men. Whenever there's a whole army that's gone away from a city, they can be tracked. And they come upon in the path this Egyptian who's dying. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. He was on the verge of death. If you go 3 days, 3 nights without water, you're almost dead. And many of the comments said, well, this is so good of David. He's showing a good heart. He is showing a good heart in doing this. But no doubt they also see there may be value in this man. This man may be part of their camp. They would have expected very tired, exhausted men. And also, it is worth noting that had David stayed in the battle at Jezreel, that the wives and the sons of David and his men, no telling what their fate might have been. Totally a work of the Lord in sending them back to Ziklag immediately. And David said unto him, to whom belongest thou, and whence art thou? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me, because 3 days agone I fell sick. We made an invasion upon the south of the Kerethites, and upon the coast which belongeth to Judah, and upon the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, canst thou bring me down to this company? And he said, swear unto me by God that thou wilt neither kill me, nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring thee down to this company. I'm always taken aback whenever I read about these pagans that we perceive as all being pagans, how they swear by the Lord and they mention God so freely. We read about how Achish, the king of Gath, how he mentions God a couple of times in speaking to David. Now we see this Egyptian slave to the Amalekites, how he's speaking of God. It's amazing how we all have this misconception that only Israel knew about God. The whole world knew about God. They just chose to worship these statues and trees. And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking. Now this is what David and the men see at the Amalekite camp. And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. No doubt this was a lot of spoil, because they attacked several places, not just Ziklag. And David comes upon them right away, and there were other camps of these of the Amalekites, just like how there were many cities within Judah and there were many cities within the Philistines. There were also many cities within the Amalekite land. So if they had not happened upon this Egyptian slave, this boy who was about to die, they never would have been able to track them right to where they needed to. This was so the work of God. And the way that I view how God interacts with man is because we see this in the scriptures, this happens in my own daily life, and it happens so often to where you can almost think, well, we don't have a free will. God's just doing all these things, teaching us lessons and all this. But I view it as it's like a dad training a son with how to ride a bike. He'll let the boy, ride a little bit, and then if the boy's about to fall over, he intercedes and he catches him, picks him back up, and pushes him along his way. I see God as intervening during these pivotal moments, whenever it's the most dire of situations. That's the way that God has always done with me. He waits until the exact last moment, just like whenever you're about to fall off your bike. That's whenever a dad would grab you and want you to go on. That's the way that I see God interacting with man, and we see this Egyptian slave being an example of this. And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men which rode upon camels and fled. So they get to the camp, they're looking out, they see them partying, drinking, getting drunk, being merry, and David says, okay, we wait. We don't drink, we don't party, we don't do anything, we just sleep. Let's just sleep, let's get our energy. And even in the comments that I read on this instance, it says, well, the Amalekites would have been badly probably hungover the next morning. And if you've ever been hungover, which I have many times, if you've ever been hungover, the last thing you want to do is fight. It would have been a perfect time to have found them at a very sore disadvantage. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. And David took all the flocks and the herds which they drave before those other cattle, and said, This is David's spoil. And David came to the 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow David, whom they had made also to abide at the brook Besor. And they went forth to meet David, and to meet the people that were with him. And when David came near to the people, he saluted them. Then answered all the wicked men and men of Belial, of those that went with David, and said, Because they went not with us, we will not give them aught of the spoil that we have recovered, save to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Obviously, David had some pretty brash men within his camp, within the army, because they start speaking up, and they're even called wicked men and men of Belial, meaning useless, worthless men, Satanists. And what they're basically saying is this. They're saying, because you didn't go to war with us, and there's a great lesson in this, because you didn't go to war with us and you stayed behind and all you did was watch our supplies and such, because you didn't do that, because you didn't go to war with us, we're not going to give you any of your possessions back. We get to keep all of that. We'll give you your sons, your daughters, your wives, but we're not going to give you anything that you had. David harshly rebukes them. Then said David, Ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord hath given us, who hath preserved us and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. He said, You didn't win the battle. God did. He says, This is not our victory. This is the Lord's victory. All we did was show up. For who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. This is a great lesson in this. Fantastic lesson. Oftentimes we'll get into this point, and I fell into this trap years ago, how we'll view certain men of God and we'll say, man, they're just gonna have so many rewards in heaven. They're doing so much more work than me, and I'm not going to receive anything. Well, first of all, God looks at the heart of a man. Why are they doing this? Why are they getting out there? Why are they popular? Why are they doing, so there's a lot of variables involved in a situation that I'm talking about with Christian rewards, heavenly rewards. But what David is telling them right here is, yes, we went to battle, but they stayed behind, and their job was just as good as our job. They watched over our stuff while we went into battle. We couldn't watch over our stuff and go into battle. They're both on the same equal level. They're both just as worthy of praise. They're just as part of this as we are. A good analogy of that is the treating the president the same as you would the janitor, and the janitor the same as you would the president. That's a good analogy, a good adage for that. But if you'll notice with the president, he lives in the White House, but the White House wouldn't be white if not for the janitor. So I mean, if you want to look at it from that circumstance, Ephesians 4:7 tells us this, But unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Wherefore he saith, When he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive, and gave gifts unto men. So the gifts that were given by Christ, it's just like what David's doing right here in a far more grand sense. He's saying, all of you, your jobs were equally as important. It's quality over quantity. Leonard Ravenhill used to preach a good sermon on that, about how David Brainerd, who died really, really young, he was a missionary to the Indians, a great man of God, died very young. He had no wife. Jonathan Edwards took care of him and his daughter. He kind of fell for his daughter a little bit, but died very, very young. He would be out in the snow preaching to these Indians, and he died of tuberculosis, I believe. But he would often compare him to John Wesley, and how John Wesley lived to 88 years old, nearly 90 years old. He was the founder of the Methodist Church, he and his brother Charles. And he would often compare the two. And he said, do you think that David Brainerd's going to get any less reward than John Wesley? Sure, John Wesley, it's not how much that you do, it's why are you doing it? How are you doing it? Quality over quantity. There's an awful lot to learn from this. And it was so from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day. And when David came to Ziklag, he sent of the spoil unto the elders of Judah, even to his friends, saying, behold, a present for you of the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. He will find, this is a very good move by David, real quick, coming to the end of this chapter. But he is giving some of the spoil to the elders of Israel. This couldn't have been more perfect timing, if you ask me, because he had been living with the Philistines. He had been rewarding the Philistines, but now he goes out, he attacks the Amalekites, the enemies of Israel. So he's lessening their power. He's restoring what Israel had lost. He's about to become king. Not in its totality, but we'll learn about that next week. But he's getting in good again with the elders of Judah by bringing these presents to them which were in Bethel, and to them which were in South Ramoth, and to them which were in Jether, and to them which were in Aurora, and to them which were in Siphmoth, and to them which were in Eshtemoa, and to them which were in Rakal, and to them which were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, and to them which were in the cities of the Kenites. It's a lot of spoils. Lots and lots. And to them which were in Hormah, and to them which were in Korashan, and to them which were in Atak, and to them which were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were wont to haunt. Now we come to the death of King Saul, the first king of Israel. And it is such a blessing that David did not partake in the battle where Jonathan would be slain. That would not have been a very appropriate ending to such a great friendship. Saul, the night before, he had met up with the witch of Endor, just to reiterate. He had ate his last meal with the witch of Endor, we think, according to the Bible. We are not told not one bit of any kind of repentance from Saul, no prayer, no trying to get back in touch with God. We're not told of any of that. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. So here's Saul, he's running, and they flee back to Mount Gilboa, which is outside of the plain. Here's another image of the place. The battle would have began around in the flat land, but Saul is fleeing, and he's trying to run up the mountain, get away from them. You can just tell the desperation in this. But not only is Saul running, but he also has arrows stuck in him. And that got me to thinking, I wonder if just for a moment did he think about those javelins that he had thrown at David while those arrows were stuck in him. I wonder if it crossed his mind. I wonder if David at all crossed his mind. We'll never know. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. We'll figure out in 2 Samuel 1 how an Amalekite claims to, whenever Saul was up trying to fall upon his sword, how an Amalekite claims that Saul begs him to kill him as well. And the Amalekite says that he goes up and he kind of pushes down on him and he does die. It is possible that that actually did happen. Even in the comments that I read, they even believe that it's a very strong possibility that it could have happened because of David's reaction. I believe that this Amalekite did aid in the death of Saul. Kind of poetic justice right there. Saul didn't kill the Amalekites, and then an Amalekite winds up killing Saul. The thought on it is that it's possible that Saul did fall upon his sword, then his armor bearer fell upon his, the armor bearer died, but Saul may have still had a little bit of life left in him, and the Amalekite came over, and Saul said, aid in continuing thrusting this sword through me, and then the Amalekite helped. That's a possibility. May not have happened that way. The Amalekite may have just been lying. We don't know. But it's David's reaction that convinces me that the Amalekite was probably telling the truth. Very sad end to Saul. No other man, no other king, no other leader that I've ever heard of ever had such a great start to their political career. No other. Saul was given every single kind of blessing that you could have imagined. No king in the Bible is ever mentioned as having it handed on a silver platter to him, all this royalty and all these rewards and kingship and everything. He's given everything right off the bat. The people are desiring a king. They're not tired of having a king or tired of the old king. No, this is a brand new thing, a brand new king. King Saul steps in with all the blessings, the cleanest slate you could have imagined. He didn't have to go through the kind of trials that David has went through. He didn't have to slay any giant. He didn't have to do anything. All he had to do was show up, and right here's the king. And it so goes to show how no matter what, God can bless you, even give you the best prophet, the best advisor, and everything. But if one's heart is not right with God, it will all crumble in the end. And we see that Saul's end is one of the worst ends that I've ever seen to not only a king, but any person ever. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men that same day together. If you'll notice, just real quick note, it's a very short chapter, but if you'll notice how David, he just got done fighting Amalekites, which Saul was commanded at the beginning of his kingship to slaughter. He didn't slaughter all of them. He didn't get rid of all of them. As a matter of fact, he kept their king, and he didn't go through with. David winds up slaughtering all of this camp, and David was outnumbered, but the Lord was with him. Saul is fighting the Philistines, outnumbered as well, but God isn't with him, and it is a ruinous thing. And they're not done with his body. Notice how Saul fears that they're going to abuse his body. No telling what they would have done to it. No telling what they did to it after he was dead, but they would have tortured Saul. I wonder how Saul treated the Philistines. You got to remember, Saul, he was throwing javelins at David. He even threw a javelin at his own son because of his anger. He couldn't maintain his pride, his anger. He was a very just illogical being, but he didn't. You don't get the feeling that he treated Israel very well, like he reigned by fear. And I just wonder how he treated his enemies. How did he treat the Philistines? I bet he did just barbarous things unto their nations. And this is really a very gruesome display that they do to him and his sons' bodies. It's almost just personal. It's like hatred. And when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley and they that were on the other side Jordan saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. Now what you would see in this is how they even cross the Jordan, the Philistines do, and they split Israel in half at this time. It's very symbolic even about how the nation would be split because Saul's son Ishbosheth. You see how there are supporters for him, and then there's supporters for David. Right at the time of Saul's death, the nation splits literally and figuratively. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, and stripped off his armor, and sent it into the land of the Philistines round about, to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now you see a little bit of similarity, how the tables reversed, but in the satanic way. I believe that God gave Saul over to Satan, possibly in order to save his soul. I don't know. But I do believe this because we see with David, he takes on a giant of the Philistines, and then he cuts off his head, and then takes the head back to Jerusalem, and the armor he takes back to his hometown as a trophy. Well, at the end of Saul's life, we're told how Saul is head and shoulders above all of Israel, so he's like a giant amongst the Israelis. And they kill him, the Philistines kill him, cut off his head, then take his armor back, and do the exact same thing that David did with Goliath, because Goliath was the man of pride and a ruler among the Philistines, no doubt. And now you see the man of pride in Israel, the very same thing happening to him. It doesn't matter what nationality that you are with God. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, rich or poor, whatever. If your heart is the same, you'll wind up the same every time. Slain, death, destruction. They do believe that they found, well, we do know that Bethshan, we have found it, the ancient ruins. Mount Gilboa, this is actually the place where Saul would have been fastened, as well as Jonathan and all of them. Mount Gilboa, they would have took them away from the mount, brought them to this city, and displayed upon this Israelite city their king and their princes. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. So you get this feeling that Saul's and his sons' bodies were probably up there a few days. Probably a little bit of decay had begun to settle in, and not a pleasant sight whatsoever. Many people, because word got to Jabesh Gilead about this, and it would have took a while to get there. Right here is Bethshan, right along the valley of Jezreel. And right down here is Jabesh Gilead. I don't think that I have to remind you all, but just in case I do, the very first great victory that Saul ever won was at Jabesh Gilead, whenever the Ammonites attacked early, very early, matter of fact, right before he was officially named king, actually. So a little bit of honor was paid to him in this. The people of Jabesh Gilead never had forgotten about the victory that Saul had over the Ammonites there, saving them and the people. So in a way to honor Saul, they are the last ones to come and actually give his body a good burial. A lot of people don't see much significance in a good burial, but a good burial has an awful lot to. How you're buried means a lot. How you die means a lot in this life. It's like if Billy Graham preached all of his life, all around the world, and suddenly he dies in a seedy hotel room with a prostitute over his body, and he's foaming at the mouth and a needle out of his arm, and all that. Just using an example. But if Billy Graham wound up like that, if he died like that, that would incredibly taint his legacy. Well, the same way goes with a burial. Everyone would say, well, they're dead. What does it matter? Yeah, but you have to think, this is royalty. This is the king of Israel. And now he's hung up like a deer or a dog upon the wall of this city, and he's no doubt, no talent, cut up, nude, birds have ate all over him, maggots, whatever, something. Everything's just so that image in the people's mind would be there whenever they thought about their first king. So Jabesh Gilead does a great honor to them and taking their bodies and giving them a proper burial. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. We'll learn about King David in the next chapter, the next book, about how he finally does come around to writing another psalm. He hasn't written a psalm the entire time he's been with the Philistines. So David's backsliding is over. He is restored, and Saul is dead. Now they're going to be seeking another king. And David writes the very first psalm is dedicated to Saul and Jonathan. We'll come to that in the next study. I do so appreciate you all for joining me today. I hope that you learned something. God, a peace be with you all. Amen.